2 years after George Floyd's murder, the street art created during that summer's uprising and the hope it inspired is fading away. So this is an opinion piece, and I thought it was really cool to kind of read through it. So excuse me if I make a little bit of mistakes here and there. So there's some things that I've heard about Black Lives Matter and the people that are involved, and some of those things haven't been too good. But this is where we're at right now. So this is by an opinion piece that was written by Charles M. Blow. And so the Great Erasure, and I thought this was a cool title because that's what's happening. Because usually when tragedies happen, everybody's looking at it, they're focusing on it, they're making laws, they're making discussion happen, and which are great things that have been going on recently, I must say, because we didn't have that before, but now we really are having that open dialogue, which we really do need it, but it doesn't stick, and that's the thing. And so this is called the Great Erasure, and so it's an opinion columnist. So Wednesday will be the second anniversary of the Lurid Street murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer. The killings of black people had become almost banal in their incessancy and redundancy. But something about this one, captured during an advancing pandemic that had forced people apart and inside, watching the world through windows and screens, drew thousands of people out into the streets, where boarded up storefronts produced the tempting tableau of a country strewn with canvases. Some saw in the uprising the potential for a revolution. They talked about the protest in the lofty language of racial reckoning, an inflection point, a fresh start on America's path to absolution from the original sin. And so, but flashes of guilt, outrage, shame often stir fleeting fealties, and the heavy gravitational pull of racial privileges and power can quickly draw mercurial allies back into the refuge of the status quo. So some good came out of the protest, to be sure. Some states and local municipalities passed or instituted police reforms. Money poured into Black Lives Matter as well as other racial injustice organizations like Black institutions. Individuals began personal journeys to become more egalitarian and more actively anti-racist, and anti-racist, of course, but artists produced hundreds of murals and thousands of pieces of other street art that for a time transformed the country. And so these are pictures that we're seeing that street art became what we saw. Black Lives Matter. We see it in different cities. We see it in Atlanta, Baltimore, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Brooklyn, Topeka, Kansas, Harlem, New York, Atlantic City, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, St. Petersburg, Florida, Montgomery, Alabama, Kansas, Oakland, California, Los Angeles, of course, Brooklyn, Michigan, Austin, Texas, Birmingham, Alabama, Washington, Manhattan, Bennington, Newark, Seattle, Orlando, Florida, Santa Cruz, California. So in the end, transformative national language proved to be an illusion. Inflation, a war in Ukraine public safety, abortion, and even a baby formula crisis have overtaken this zeitgeist. And so support for Black Lives Matter has diminished. So federal policy or federal police reform and federal voter protection failed to pass the Senate. And the founders of Black Lives Matter have been drawn into controversies about how they handled its money. I've learned not to expect much from the America, so it has a deep capacity for change, but a shallow desire for it, which I have to agree, because we could be on this trip like, oh, we got to do something. We got to really like work to try to make things change. But then all of a sudden, our attention span is very short, and then we forget very quickly. And so I have embraced, it goes on to say, the wise desire to not be betrayed by too much hoping, as James Baldwin put it. But I worry about young people in all of this. It is their faith that most vulnerable to damage, that's most vulnerable to damage, and they were the ones who most believed that change was not only possible but imminent, only to have America retreat and retrench. Okay, so now not only their allies are reversing course on issues like police reform, and the country is also facing a full backlash toward protest itself, but dozens of states have passed laws restricting the right to protest. And so this is really troubling, you guys. So protests, they're going to stop that, or they're going to try to enforce jailing people and, using that as a way to try to stop you from voicing your freedom, your right to speech. And so you have no freedoms. So just this week, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida barred citizens from protesting outside private homes, and more than a dozen have criminalized teaching full and accurate racial history. Okay, so the Great Erasure is underway, and not so much an attempt to erase the uprising itself as an attempt to blunt its effects, but there is no example of the erasure more striking than the continual destruction and removal of slow vanishing of the much of the street art produced in the wake of George Floyd's killing. So according to the database compiled, 3 professors at the University of St. Thomas in the Minnesota, Heather, Shirley, David Todd, Lawrence, and Paul Laura. There were once approximately 2,700 murals, graffiti stickers posted affixed to surfaces and light projections, created in the response to George Floyd, mostly in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Shirley Lawrence called it the largest proliferation of street art that was around in one idea or issue or event in history. But many of those pieces have disappeared, sometimes because of exposure to traffic or elements, sometimes because of deliberate attempts to erase them, but the business owners quietly removed the graffiti planks from their storefronts, and some of the murals have been defaced. And so for this project, the colleagues and I look at 115 murals created by Floyd's death and tried to determine how many had been maintained. So it is not a comprehensive list, but although it is hard to imagine that any such list could be. So there's 37 fully intact in cities of Oklahoma, California. A few vestiges remain of what were once vibrant murals painted on asphalt and walls. So these are like still photos of what once was, or what is still remaining. And so this is in California because it had commissioned this mural, which included a portrait of John Chesmart, a former member of the Black Liberation Army convicted of killing a state trooper in 1973. The lawsuit was dismissed, but by that point, the city had already removed the mural. And so it goes on down the list. And so you can see all the different things that explain how murals were removed. You could see what looked like Black Lives Matter was there on that street. It has been removed. And so all the cities will just pan down real quick. You can see where they've been removed. And so over the past 2 months, I talked to art historians, museum directors, curators, activists, artists who have created murals. The picture and emergence of the group determined that to preserve as much of the art as possible while understanding that it can't all be saved, and acknowledgement of inherent ephemeral nature of street art. This art was created in a moment, for a moment. Permanence was often not the central consideration, of course, but to lose it would be to lose the cultural record of the time and the record of profound significance of the magnitude of what had transpired during that time, the George Floyd killing. So a generation of young people and young artists found that their voice was used in it and creating the arts movement that sits in the canon alongside the Black artist movement in 1960s and 1970s and Harlem Renaissance. That was a very, very exciting time. So you might even say it mirrors on the enormous scale of Wall of Respect mural that was first painted in 1967 by the Visual Arts Workshop and the Organization of Black American Culture in Chicago. What may have been different about this movement and the outlook of the generation that created it is Aaron Bryant, curator of photography, visual anthropology, contemporary historian, Smithsonian National Museum, and African American History and Culture, described it to be me as a sense of entitlement. So these activists and artists believe that they have absolute right and even responsibility to express themselves to that he told me. So they aren't necessarily the generation that was raised to be silent. So the art produced during after the uprising, was powerful, emotional, energetic, like a lightning storm. But like lightning, the illumination and contours, the way it split the sky soon dimmed and vanished. And so the art tapped into something, provided language for it. So as Franklin Sermons, director of Perez Arts Museum Miami, put it, some of the best art is created under situations not only duress, but immediate response, and that is the part of the parcel with this sense of collective identity that I think many of us felt in that moment, and to see it visualized was really heartening. So for me, it was a transcendence. So it brought a fresh, abounding energy to a standing tradition. And so the murals, the instruments of the memorial have long been featured of the Black grief and remembrance that they are Amaka, and I can't pronounce the last names, but Kuwa, assistant professor in sociology and anthropology of George Mason University, eloquently describes gravestone murals awake work haunting the urban spaces where Black lives have been lost. So by no means these are murals of expression solely of African Americans, so they can be found in many communities and many cultures around the world, tradition producing them in centuries old. But in way of Floyd his murder globalized gravestones murals in service of a singular subject, but perhaps the most iconic of these murals was with the words of Black Lives Matter written in large black letters or block letters, and down the middle of the streets with first painted the District of Columbia that was so large that it was legible on the satellite images. So people like Sarah Lewis, Associate Professor, History and Art and Architecture in the African American Studies, Harvard University, saw it as a powerful testament symbolizing the precarity of black life in one or the open terrain. But the activists soon pointed out that the politicians who supported the art often resisted policies designed to rectify the historic injustices of Black Lives Matter that had highlighted. So when the District of Columbia painted its mural, the local Black Lives Matter chapter called it a performative distraction from the real policy changes designed to appease white liberals while ignoring other demands. The mural Muriel Bowser was on the wrong side of history, they said. So Black Lives Matter means defund the police. So these tensions stretch beyond Washington and Minneapolis, the intersection where George Floyd was murdered, now called George Floyd Square. George Floyd Global Memorial Project has taken on the Herculean task of preserving all protest objects, items the group calls offerings, including art murals in the square. So it has collected 5,000 artifacts, preserved them with the help of art conservators, and stored them in cardboard boxes in small rooms in a community theater. So the group has ambitions to one day build a museum to house it all. And so some of the murals in the George Floyd Square were being repainted. I visited this month ahead of the observance of the second anniversary of George Floyd's murder. So new ones have been added. And it says that featuring the black people that were killed elsewhere, some lost to community violence rather than state violence. This level of ambition makes Minneapolis both the epicenter in the preservation of efforts and an anomaly. Governments in cities across the country, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Redwood City, California, have erased the murals, reflecting the reality that many lack the true, sustained commitment to Black lives. So this is Tulsa, Oklahoma right here, Black Lives Matter. So activists painted the mural on what was once Black Wall Street and the wealthy community that was ravaged in 1921 race massacre. City's officials later removed the mural because it was never officially approved, but before they did, protesters erected paper tombstones on the site to memorialize Black lives lost to violence. And so this was the Black Wall Street right here. And so basically that is everything. And I just thought this was really something that I thought was really interesting to share. I don't know if anybody has seen this, but these things grab my attention right away. And so, and having said that, also there's a lot of controversy around the Black Lives Matter groups that have formed. There's people that have been involved with some scandals or some are tied to some somewhat labeling. So we don't know all of those things, but I've heard those things in the works and they sound really bad. But having said that, this is an unfortunate situation, but we're seeing the murals that were created and the fervor and the vigilance just sort of fade away. And that's what happens with these crazy tragedies like this. It's like the energy is there, but it just kind of like simmers down after a while and you don't see it anymore. And so, what will come out of this, we shall see, and shall see what develops with the Black Lives Matter movement groups that have formed. There's different chapters, different groups, different people with different agendas. So we will see what happens with those groups. I have heard some not so good things about certain people that they were involved in embezzlement, and but those things are hearsay, so we don't know until those stories develop. More and more information will come out, of course, because when you're doing the work of community, you have to stay in line with doing the work of community. I do know that. And if you're going to help people, you have to really help people. You can't help just yourself. And so you have to be about the work of the community, but then you have to also look at, there's two sides to every story, because some people will look at the focus on what people have acquired and what they've gotten through the years of service, and they focus on that and say, well, look at that car and look at that house that person has got. But this person has been with this group for how long, and what have they been raising a lot of money, and so you don't think they wouldn't upgrade their house status or their car status after a period of time or a level of time of working in service for a company or for a group that they created. Of course, that's going to happen. But then again, too, okay, so what money are you using? Are you putting the money in the communities? Or are you just putting the money in your pocket? So those are big questions. And so those, I guess we'll see later down the road how those develop. So, and having said that, I'm going to let this video go. Like, comment, subscribe, and thanks for listening.